Once upon a time, in a quiet suburb, there lived a 15-year-old boy named Max, whose life was steeped in loneliness and secrets. His mother had disappeared 5 years earlier under mysterious circumstances, leaving only faint memories of her voice and warmth. His father, overcome with grief, withdrew into himself and spent more and more time at work, avoiding contact with his son. Max was left to his own devices, and an old house on the edge of the forest, full of dust and dark corners, became his refuge. His usual place for reflection was the forest, thick, ancient, with shadows that whispered stories of the past. One day, he discovered a well there. Around it, the earth was black and cracked, as if it had been burned. Legend said that this well led to another world where shadows lived, but Max believed that this was a fairy tale. Until one evening. That night, he heard a strange creaking sound coming from the basement. It wasn't just a sound, it was a challenge. Max sat in his room, looking at a photograph of his mother. Her smile seemed distant, almost unattainable. He remembered how they played together in the back garden, how she told him stories before going to bed. "If you were here, you'd know what to do," he muttered, clutching the photograph in his hands. Suddenly, that same creaking sound came from the basement. Max froze, as if his feet were rooted to the floor. He had heard this sound before, but always tried to ignore it. However, today something was different. He felt a spark of determination ignite inside him. Taking a flashlight, he slowly went downstairs. The basement greeted him with a cold and damp smell. A porcelain doll lay on the floor among the boxes covered in dust. Her face was cracked, and her eyes were empty like an abyss. But the most terrible thing was that she moved. "You have to go," came the whisper. Max dropped the flashlight and jumped back. "Into the tunnels. The answers to your questions are there." Max looked at her, feeling fear grip his throat. But the doll no longer moved. The next day, Max could not think of anything else. The doll's words burned his mind, causing more and more questions. What are these tunnels? How are they connected to him? And most importantly, could it be connected to his mother? His hand involuntarily reached for the old diary he had found in his mother's room. Among the entries was one, strange and incoherent: "The tunnels are calling. I must find them. For him." Max felt his heart squeeze. For whom? For me, he thought. That night, he heard the whispers from the basement again. He called to him, promising answers. But with that came fear. "No, this is madness. I will not go there," Max said firmly to himself, lying in bed. He tried to convince himself that all this was just a figment of his imagination, caused by loneliness and longing. But as soon as he closed his eyes, the world around him darkened, plunging him into an icy nightmare. He saw the doll again. It stood by his bed, unnaturally bent. Its head moved with frightening slowness, as if something inside it was breaking with each movement. Max felt cold sweat running down his back, and his body felt like lead, not allowing him to move. Her eyes, empty and soulless, looked straight at him. A whisper penetrated his consciousness, reminiscent of the howling of the wind through a cracked window. "Your mother is waiting. You want to save her, right?" The words echoed in his head, making his heart pound. It felt like the walls of the room were closing in, and the darkness was becoming tangible, ready to swallow him. He tried to scream, but his voice was stuck in his throat, as if it was locked in along with the fear. When he woke up, his body was shaking as if in a fever. Max caught his breath convulsively, feeling his heart pounding so hard that it was giving him pain in his chest. Cold sweat soaked the sheets, and in his head there was only one conclusion: he no longer had a choice. At dawn, he went to the same well where he met the forester, whom the locals called Grandpa Graham. The old man looked at Max intently, as if he knew why he came. "You heard them, right?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "These tunnels do not forgive the weak." Max frowned. "Do you know what's there?" Graham was silent for a long moment, then nodded. "It's not just a place. It's a trap. But if you're going there for your mother, be prepared for the truth to be worse than any lie." He handed Max an old lantern and a knife with a handle carved from bone. "Stick to the light. And remember, the eyes deceive. Never believe what you see." Max stood at the well, feeling his hands trembling. With the lantern in one hand and the knife in the other, he began to descend. With each step down, the light grew weaker and the air grew heavier. At the bottom, he found himself in a narrow passage that stretched into endless darkness. The silence was absolute, but sometimes he heard a rustling sound, as if someone was watching him. His lantern snatched scraps of walls covered in strange patterns from the darkness. Suddenly, laughter rang out. High, shrill, as if someone was playing a broken violin. "It's a trap," Max whispered, but stepped forward. The passage became narrower and narrower until Max found himself in a large room. Its walls were covered with dolls, staring at him with empty eye sockets. He felt fear paralyze him. Suddenly one of the dolls moved. Its voice sounded right in his head. "You cannot escape, boy. You will be one of us." Max ran back, but behind him there was only a wall. He realized that there was no way out. "Show yourself," he shouted, holding the knife in front of him. The figure of the Queen of the Dolls emerged from the darkness. She was huge, her eyes glowing with a scarlet light. "Have you come for the truth? Fool. The truth destroys. Are you ready for this?" The queen raised her hand, and the dolls came to life. They slowly surrounded him, their movements were broken, but fast. Max raised the lantern and pointed the light directly at them. The dolls froze, and the queen let out a roar that split the air. "You think the light will save you? You're wrong," she said, and her voice sounded like breaking glass. Max took a step forward, though his legs were shaking. "Where is my mother? Tell me, or I will destroy you." The queen laughed. "You think she's alive? Foolish boy. She's already a part of me." Max realized that the light from the lantern was his only defense. He stepped closer to the queen, pointing the beam at her. Her body began to tremble, and the walls of the room creaked. "You cannot destroy me," the queen screamed, drawing long shadows from the wall that began to wrap around Max. His lantern flickered, threatening to go out. He remembered the words of the forester, "The eyes deceive." Max closed his eyes, focused on the sound of his breathing, and waited for the moment when the lantern flared with a bright light. The queen let out a deafening screech, and her shadows dissipated. At that moment, the silhouette of a woman appeared in the room. It was his mother. Her face, sad and calm, looked almost ghostly. "You have to let me go, son," she said, looking at him tenderly. "It's the only way to stop her." Max felt his heart break. Tears streamed down his cheeks, but he nodded. "I'll let you go if it saves you." The light from the lantern, like a clap of lightning, blinded the room, engulfing the queen. Her scream, full of rage and despair, tore through the air, and then suddenly died away, leaving silence. The dolls fell to the ground like severed puppet strings, and their eyes, once empty and eerie, became nothing more than glass. Max stood, breathing heavily, feeling the air fill with lightness. It seemed that the walls no longer pressed, and the darkness retreated, leaving only a faint smell of ozone. His mother disappeared in a golden glow, but not before her voice sounded in his head, soft and warm. "I'm proud of you, my boy. You are free." In the center of the room, among the rubble, lay a pendant, small, as if glowing from within. Max bent down, picked it up with trembling hands. It was warm, like a ray of sunlight, as if it contained all her love and care. It was not just a gift, it was a symbol that she would always be there. Max returned to the well, his legs barely holding him up after everything he had been through. The weight of loss hung on his heart like a stone pulling him into the abyss. But a strange feeling of lightness pierced his consciousness, like a morning ray of light. He was free. Every minute in the tunnels left invisible scars on him, but at the same time, it hardened his spirit. Now he knew that he was no longer the boy who had descended into this dark nightmare. Grandfather Graham stood at the exit, his wrinkled face silently approving. There was pride in his eyes, as if he expected Max to return, knowing what he had been through. "You came back," the old man said, his voice deep and warm, like the crackling of coals in the fireplace. "You did it." Max just nodded silently. His fingers tightly clutched the pendant, which still radiated a barely perceptible warmth. "I did it," he thought, looking at the old sky above the forest. "But who am I now?" "You came back," he said, nodding. "You did it." Max only smiled, clutching the pendant in his hand. A few months passed. Max was back in his home, but the feelings of calm never fully returned. He tried to convince himself that his fears were in the past, that the darkness could no longer touch him. But sometimes, especially at night, the wind in the forest sounded as if it were whispering words he did not want to understand. Sometimes he dreamed. In this dream, his mother looked at him with such warmth that her smile illuminated even the darkest corners of his mind. Her hands, once cold and strange, now filled his soul with peace. Waking up, he clutched the pendant to his heart, as if it were his only anchor in a stormy sea of memories. But that night, everything changed. Max winced as he heard a painfully familiar creak, a sound that echoed from his past. His gaze fell on the lantern under the bed. The glowworm of light flickered, although Max did not touch it. His breath caught as a shadow appeared on the wall. It moved, as if it had a life of its own, bending in unnatural shapes. In this play of light and darkness, something flickered that made his heart clench. It was familiar, but strange. He tried to smile, convincing himself that it was just his imagination. But something in that shadow, in its cold silence, made him shudder. This can't be the end, he thought, and an oppressive feeling arose inside him that the story was not over yet.